Now, we talked about a lot of things today: skills, tools, regulations, people, culture. But there's one more thing that we have to talk about before we can get the benefits of our analytics programs. We can have all the answers, we can have all the insight in the world, but remember, we cannot influence people's behaviors, and without that, we have nothing. We need not only to have the data, the answers, the insights, and all that, but we have to put them together in a way that people will listen, and they'll remember, and they'll act. And I've been through countless sessions about this, and the idea of how do we do this? Well, you tell stories. When I was taking presentation training years ago, one of the instructors told me what was going to happen after I did. I thought, brilliant presentation. Not an ego here, but I thought it was brilliant. And I had the graphs, and I had the story right, and I had the supporting data. And he said, how much do you think people are going to remember from that in a day or two? I figured a lot. I had no idea. One thing, he said. One thing. If you're really good, he said, looking at me as if I wasn't, shot my ego again, but he said, if you're really good, two things. Well, I checked the research later, and guess who's right? I thought of all the presentations I'd seen, and if you actually think about this yourself, with my experience in there, how much do you remember? So this is just stunning. How do you get across, because it's easy to say, put it in one thing, put it on one slide. That's garbage. We've got complex ideas and data and learning and things that we need to share. Remember all that? Stories. People have been doing this for years, ages, in fact, since the earliest time. People remember stories, and stories allow us to pack an incredible amount of data into something that is rememberable. So if you want to win people over or get them to remember things, and you want to get them to do things and be inspired, tell a story. No, you tell a story to communicate information to a broad audience, to the C-suite, to the board of directors, to the corporation itself, to the people who are leading the change and working on this, the employees who are implementing it. And so how do you do that? You can learn it. The next session is going to offer you some insights on that, and I urge you to pay close attention to this, because if you can turn data and analytics into a compelling narrative that will inform better decision-making, you can help drive change. Joining us today is Emma Warrilow. She's the Senior Vice President of Research and Data Insights from Shift Paradigm. Emma, come on up, and you're going to wrap up the day with telling us how to tell stories.
Thanks, Jim.
Good stuff.
Thank you. Okay. Before I start, I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to Shift Paradigm, because as you heard, that's the company I come from. We're a relatively new name in the Canadian marketplace. We came together as a merger of three companies, and a year ago we became Shift Paradigm. And the three companies were a company that I founded 20 years ago called Data Insight Group, who specialized in helping people use their data most effectively, as well as an organization called Trendline Interactive, who were very well respected for their email production and consulting services around complex email campaigns, and LeadMD, a marketing technology and revenue acceleration strategy firm who have done some amazing work in that area. So we brought these companies together, and our mission is to help sales and marketing teams work together through solutions rooted in data, in technology, strategy, and others. So I just wanted to give you just a brief introduction in case you wondered who I was and why I was here. So we've heard a lot about storytelling today. It keeps coming up. So my original question at the top here is, why are we talking about storytelling at an analytics conference? I think you've already heard a couple of the answers to that, in that I think even though this is a conference sponsored by an IT company, and it is a topic that doesn't sound like it should be about stories, we've shown that fundamental to data-driven decisions is the organizations who are successfully using data to drive their decisions are among our most successful. Couple of examples here. Obviously, we all know that Google uses data a lot, but I'll give you an example of one of the ways that Google has used data for decision making. They've used data to improve their HR practices. They've taken a sample of 10,000 or a study of 10,000 of their managers and analyzed them for competencies that were most likely to yield positive reviews for their management. They mined the data of those performance reviews, and they found that a list of competencies for high-performing managers, and they created training programs specifically to meet the needs of their managers in the future. And they were able to raise their favorability scores for their managers quite significantly as a result. Disney. Anyone who's been to a Disney park in the last number of years has probably heard of a magic band. Disney uses a magic band, which is a bracelet that everybody who visits a park wears, that contains vast amounts of information because it tracks the user across the park. It's used as your hotel room key, and it is used as your payment method for things. It's used as your ticket to get into the park. What they use it for is a lot of things, but one of the things they use it for is for park logistics and customer experience. So what they've been able to do in real time is look at the data and decide if they need to deploy new tactics in order to move people around the park. So if they notice that a lot of people in one area of the park, they are perhaps long lineups in that area of the park for the rides, they do things to move people around. They might literally send out a parade in the middle of the park that drives half the people following the parade into another area of the park. So they're able to use the data they collect to really drive real-time decisions about how they run their parks. Yeah, it's just, you know, these are the kind of things people are doing to drive decisions. Loblaw, closer to home. The PC Plus program, again, uses a lot of data to offer customers tailor-made offers. One of the decisions they made, apparently, about this, and I have no personal information about this, it's just a story I read, but one of the decisions they made was when they started out the PC Plus program, in order to design the program, they had thought that they were going to use segmented offers. And they use segments, I'm sure, for lots of things, but they thought they were going to use segmented offers. But what they discovered very quickly was when they analyzed the data, they discovered that no two customers are alike. One person buys the big box of bran flakes, one person buys corn flakes. Even though they might be in the same family-centered segment, they're not the same. And so they ended up making the decision to make the program much more customized and tailored as a result of the data that they had. So those are just a few examples of how people are using decisions in data. So why then are so many companies still making decisions based on the gut? Still very much the case in many organizations, we're still making on the gut. We heard today some of those reasons. We heard about data quality and trust. People don't trust the data, therefore they're not going to use it to make a decision. They might see some results and go, yeah, but I don't think we collected that data in the right way. I don't think I trust it. In some cases, it's capabilities. Either the decision makers themselves don't have the data literacy to be able to interpret what they're seeing, or the analysts themselves aren't able to derive enough insights that are helping people make decisions. In other cases, it's just because we've always done it this way. It's cultural resistance. But we know that fundamentally, no decision maker is going to use data if they can't access it and understand it. And that's where storytelling comes in. So let me start by telling you a little story that came from a book called Made to Stick by Dan and Chip Heath. Dan and Chip Heath, I believe it was Chip Heath, is a professor at Stanford. And he did an experiment with some of his students. He asked all of his students to stand up for 1 minute each and give a presentation. They each gave a short presentation, and I think there were maybe 8 students. Each gave a short presentation. He asked everybody to rate the presentations, and then he said, okay, I'm just going to show you a video. So he distracted the students, thinking that part of the exercise was over. After a very short video, maybe it's 10 minutes later, he asked the students to each write down everything they remember about the presentations they just heard. So what did Jim say? What did Fred say? He literally asked them to write down everything they could remember. Because he said, it's only been 10 minutes, we should be able to remember. And probably you won't be surprised to find out that they were very surprised by how little they could remember. Very little indeed. And this is what they actually learned. They noticed that on average, every student who spoke used about 2.5 statistics in their presentation. So they said, 80% of people do this and 20% do this. And only 1 in 10 of them told a story. So maybe there were 10 presentations, not 8, but yeah. That's what they called the speaking statistics. But when they looked at what people remembered, the opposite happened. That the students 63% of the students could remember a story, only 5% could remember any one statistic. If you think about the privacy presentation we just had, I'm going to guess most of you remember $25 million fines. You don't remember Bill C, whatever it was, or we don't remember those things. We remember the stories that are kind of hit us in that kind of compelling way. Stories have the power to help people understand and bring data to life. So what makes a good story? So we all remember the fairy tales of our youth and the various things that we've always heard. The rules that applied when Cinderella was written are the same kind of rules that apply to storytelling today. Essentially, stories have three main components to them. We start with our setup. Once upon a time, there was a young girl who lived with her mean stepmother and her ugly stepsisters, and was working to the bone. And then we have a build-up. We basically tell the story through a series of facts or information that leads us towards our ending. So Cinderella had a visit from a fairy godmother. She went to the ball. She danced with the prince. She had to run out at midnight. She lost her shoe. The prince was looking far and wide for her across the country. And so all these steps lead us to the big payoff, the big conclusion, which is that the prince finds his princess and they live happily ever after. So that's a story. That's a way we know to tell a story. We all tell stories that way. But we forget to do that when we're thinking about data. And these same principles apply to analytic storytelling. When we think about our analytic story, we still have to think about what is the setup? How do we build to the conclusion? And what is the conclusion? And so, we might tell the story that says the setup might be, we notice we have a problem with customer churn. We want to figure out what to do about it. And the build-up might be, initially we'd heard that the hypothesis was that we were losing our older customers. So we looked at our age cohorts and we found out that in fact we weren't. The churn was about the same across all the cohorts. So then we looked at our channels of acquisition and we noticed that we were losing more of our online acquired customers. So then we dug a little deeper and looked at which offers those customers were getting, the ones that were churning. And so we build the story along the way. As we do it, we look at only the facts that help us build to the conclusion or help us refute the things that'll take us off track. So sometimes we have to help people stop going down the wrong road. We want to keep them on the road they're on. And then we end up with our conclusion and our recommendations. And so in this case, we might say we're recommending we remove the 2-for-1 offer off the website because these customers cost us more money than it costs to service them, and 90% of them leave after the first year, whatever that might be. So we build the story to take us to the conclusion so that the people understand what they're trying to get to. As Kimberly said, it's all about knowing what problem we're trying to solve. So I have a picture here of a woman at the top of the stairs because when I was a young woman, my mother was probably my age, and she used to often get to the top of the stairs and call down and say, "Emma, what did I come up here for?" And analysts do this all the time. We get excited, we get some data, we have a problem we think we're going to solve, we think we're working on a problem, and then we get all excited because each time we look at our data, it takes us down a new avenue. And sometimes those avenues are helping us get to where we want to get to. And sometimes they're taking us off course. And from an analytic point of view, it's all useful, right, to find out where we need to go. But when it comes to the storytelling, when it comes to the story we need to tell, we need to remember why we came. We need to make sure that we're thinking about what is it that we are supposed to be answering, and make sure that's what our first focus is of our story. Because too often we go, well, we did this and we did this and we did this, and we look at all these other things and we don't remember why we came. Analytics visualizations can tell stories too. But sometimes, again, we lose track a little bit of why we came. And we tend to get really excited about the analysis we've done and about the neat things we can do. Sometimes we get really excited about the way we can present the information, and we think we've done something really cool and neat. Anyone ever looked at a Sankey diagram? Interesting, can be really useful, but also can be really confusing if you don't have the right application for it. The term on the top of this page is MEGO, or MEGO, and MEGO stands for my eyes glaze over. And that's how a lot of people feel when an analyst does a presentation. They get there and they think, oh my God, will they ever stop? Because we got so much to tell them and we're so excited about it. And one of the things that I love about working in analytics, and one of the things I love about working with analysts, is that we're passionate about the stuff we do. We love getting into the data. We love to share what we've learned. But we have to ask ourselves, what does the audience need to know? And they actually don't care how much work we did. As much as that hurts us to know that, they don't care how much work we did. They just need to know what the answers and what it means for them as a business. And so we have to make ourselves think about it that way. So before you write a story, so we talked about the setup and the build-up. Before you do that even, before you start the story itself, you need to think about some of the components of the story. What are the components of who you're talking to and what you're doing? The key factors to consider. Who is our message for? Who am I telling the story to? Is it my senior executives? Is it my marketing department? Is it my, the folks that I am doing some analysis for on my school parent council because they want to know something about the growth of the school? Who is my audience? What are the key takeaways I want them to remember? So Jim said most people only remember one or two things from a presentation. We have to figure out what those things are we want them to remember from our presentation and make sure that we keep that in mind as we build our story. How do you want them to feel? So that number, that 25 million number, scared us. And that was what it was intended to do. I mean, I'm not sure she'd say that, but that's, in a way, that when you tell a story, you're going, oh, I better pay attention to this now because it's a scary big number. Some cases we do want people to feel alarmed. Sometimes we want them to feel happy. We were really successful in our last campaign. We want everyone to pat themselves on the back at how well we did. Sometimes we just want them to know that we've got it, that we're going to educate them, that we're going to show them what we've learned, and they need to know we've got it. But we need to be clear what we're trying to convey in order to build a good story. Because without that, we won't build a good story. And the final thing is, Jim has mentioned this a couple times today, so I'm going to reiterate it. What do we want them to do? Because unless they do something with the data and analytics we're using, we haven't actually done our job. Nobody hires analysts so that they can get nice numbers and pretty pictures and great dashboards. They actually hire analysts so they can make decisions and use that information to propel them forward. And if we haven't managed to get them to do that, and if we're not thinking what we're trying to get them to do, we're not going to get there. So let me give you an example. In March of 2020, and I apologize for using a COVID reference, but I find it's an interesting one to use. In March of 2020, the Imperial College in London, with the WHO and the global infectious disease scientists, did an exhaustive look, country to country, at all of the data around the projected impacts of COVID and what impact various mitigation measures could have, staying home, wearing masks, all the different things that we all had to do. So they gathered a lot of data. They built a very large spreadsheet with all the information and data, and then they had to figure out what to do with it. So one of the things that what they did was they went to Science magazine and they published a great report. So I'm not the scientific audience, and maybe the scientific audience loved these complex visualizations, but I got to tell you, even as an analyst, I found them a bit confusing. I have no idea what it was trying to say. Fortunately, so I would say my eyes glazed over, as we've talked about. But fortunately, there was a 10-page paper to actually illuminate the story. And in Science magazine, people are probably willing to read that paper. But the messages that were contained in this paper really need to reach a much larger audience than the few people who read Science magazine. No offense to Science magazine, but I'm guessing it's not as big an audience as we needed. So the CDC took that information, and they wanted to build a data story. They wanted to use a visualization that would help tell the story of what we needed to get from that 10-page paper. And so they built a visualization that looked like this. Okay? The audience for their visual was probably the average North American, and probably some doctors and health professionals as well. The message was saying that without protective measures, so the picture shows if you had protective measures, here's the healthcare system capacity. Without protective measures, here's the peak that we're going to hit too soon. Simple picture, which told a lot. They used color, they used very simple word placement to tell the story that they needed to tell. They didn't have 10 pages of report, they had a simple story. They took the numbers off the graph, they made it simple. And they made an image that people could understand. And so great stories also have to meet these three criteria. They have to be impactful, which again is about getting the user to do something. They need to be memorable. We need to be able to tell someone at the water cooler what we learned. We want people to go to work the next day and tell their friends about what they heard about this and why they should do what they're asking to do. And the third one, which is a little bit different than what we talked about so far, is they also need it to be personal. People relate to stories about people. even when we are perhaps reading a story that has an animal as a protagonist, we usually ascribe that animal human characteristics because people like to hear about people. And so typically a good story is one that has a human aspect to it. So when I think about this one, it has a human aspect for lots of reasons. But if you look at this little tweet that accompanied it, which I'll read you the last line of this tweet. In this tweet, Drew really connects it to a human experience and allows us to really get the message of this. So he says it's the difference between finding an ICU bed in a ventilator or being treated in a parking lot tent. And when you hear that, and when you think about that, you think about your loved ones, you think about your grandparents, you think about the fact that you want them. You remember that scene in Grey's Anatomy where everyone's in the parking lot running around like crazy things and the interns are trying to, give people tracheotomies? You don't want that. You want them to be safely tucked away in the ICU bed. And so because just that simple phrase accompanied by this picture humanized it, we know what we need to do. And again, I'm not trying to be political here, and there's lots of people who may not agree with all this, but that was what they wanted to do was convey this message, and I believe it's a very compelling way of doing it without even a lot of words. Just in simple visuals, they were able to compel this message. So, wouldn't be a good presentation without an Einstein quote. I like this quote from Einstein, which says, if I only had 1 hour to save the world, I'd spend 55 minutes defining the questions and only 5 minutes finding the answers. That's my favorite thing about analytics, is I think that's a really important message for analytics. But today I'd like to add to it. I'd spend the next hour figuring out how to tell everyone what I found out. Okay. I'll leave you with one final quote, which is that facts don't persuade, feelings do, and stories are the best way to get at those feelings. So that's all I had to say today.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. I put you in a tough position to wrap up a long day with a lot of great people in it.
A lot of great content came before me.
You knocked it out of the park.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to remember that in this as we go through this. By the way, I was a former consultant, so I would have spent the hour solving the problem, an hour telling me I would have billed them for 3. Yeah. Just kidding. Little consulting joke out there. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
Thank you so much for wrapping up this day with us. And you got to come back for my podcast. We have to talk more. Okay.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.